Welcome back, everyone. In this video, our goal is to answer some common questions that arise about the foliage tools after students have been introduced to foliage mode. Question number 1. This is a good one. What happens to my foliage if I attempt to sculpt the landscape and it already has foliage placed upon it? Well, I have that scenario right in front of us. I've placed some foliage here on our landscape, but have not yet sculpted it. So let's see what happens. I've got my landscape sculpting tab here selected. I've got my sculpting tool selected with these settings. And of course, I've got my layer selected here. And let's just go ahead and sculpt underneath. Let's see what happens. It looks like the foliage doesn't pop up at all, does it? But when I release my left mouse button click, you can see I'm covering up the rock there by sculpting it. When I release my sculpting, then you will see the foliage placed atop your sculpting. So you shouldn't have to worry here. The foliage does the best job it can to be placed upon your sculpting as appropriate, but you may need to go into your foliage select or lasso tool to fine-tune some of the placement there. But in general, UE4 does a pretty good job when you sculpt the landscape beneath it in terms of placing that foliage atop your new sculpting. All right, question number 2. If I adjust some foliage type properties inside of my foliage type asset, will that affect the properties of that foliage I've already placed into my level? Well, let's try that out. I'm coming under my Content Landscapes Foliage Types folder. Let's go ahead and double click on our FT Bush 01 here. Now you can see I've already got some placed out here, so you should make sure that if you're playing along at home that you've already got some of these placed out here. And let me actually select my bush over here so you can see some of the settings I'm going to have down here. Double click on my bush. So here are my foliage type asset settings. And here is my settings that appear for my FT bush over in the mesh list. Now, as I go about adjusting some of these settings in our FT bush foliage type asset, these changes will be reflected immediately back in our level. Let's give this a try. Let's change out our mesh from an SM bush to, let's try the chair. And so you can see I've changed it to a chair here, and if I jump back to our level, you can see all of our bushes have now been replaced by chairs. And you can see that change reflected right down here in our mesh list details as well. So that's one that you will see updated immediately. I'm just going to change that back to a bush here quickly. Another one that will update immediately is under our instance settings. We've currently got this cast shadow checked on. So if I were to check in our level right here, we can see that our bushes are casting a shadow. If I was, however, to check it off and jump back to our level, you can see that that is immediately reflected as well. Okay, let me go ahead and check that back on. Now, when it comes to your foliage types placement settings or your foliage types paint settings, these group of settings right here, you must come through your reapply tool to adjust that for these instances out here. For example, if I was to go back into my FT Bush asset right here and say, hey, I want my Z offset to now be a minimum of 500, which is going to change the maximum to 500. If I jump back here into my level, I don't see that they are now 500 Unreal units off the ground. That change does not apply immediately. However, I'm just going to set this back to normal here. If I was to jump back here and then go into my reapply tool and say, hey, Bush, I do want you to have a Z offset of 500. And then I go ahead and click. You can see how those bushes have jumped up into the air. Let me just Control Z that a few times. So your placement settings and your paint settings. The only way to update those once they've been placed in your level is through the reapply tool. However, in the asset itself, you can swap out the mesh and some of these instance settings, and those will update immediately. All right, next question. Is there a way for me to specify which landscape layers my foliage types can be applied to? For example, can I make it so that rocks can only be applied to path layers? The answer to this is yes, they can, although this is a little bit of a hidden thing. So this is awesome to know about. I'm glad this question was asked. I'm going to exit out of my FT bush here, and I'm going to open up my rock, my FT rock here. Let's open up this guy. And if we come under our placement settings right here, we've got this little drop down arrow here to show advanced. If I click this open, I have an inclusion landscape layers option, and I've also got an exclusion landscape layers as well. I'm going to click this plus button for inclusion of landscape layers. And now all we got to do here is name a layer that we would like this to be applied to, or that it is valid to be applied to. So I'm going to set this to path, and again, this should be the exact name as we find over here in our landscape paint mode. We're talking these layer names right here: mud, grass, gravel, path, rock, etc. So we're saying, hey rock, you can be included on a path layer, any path layer that is at least 50% path. By that we're talking if there's any intersection between path right here and say snow, as long as it's at least 50% path, a rock can be applied to that. Okay, so with that inclusion landscape layers set to path, we're going to save that and let's test this out. Well, actually, it's not restricted. It's not allowing me to save right now. That's an issue for off camera. And so I've got a rock selected over here in my foliage mode. We're going to say we want to apply that. I'm going to uncheck the bush. And let's try going into paint mode, not reapply mode. We're going to do single instance, and let's see. I want to do some large rocks so we can see this. Let's go a minimum scale of 10. Make it rather large so we can see it. So here is a path layer. So if I left click here, I should see a rock. Boom, and we do. Now we got snow over here, so can I apply a rock? I am left clicking and I am restricted from doing so. However, if I am to come right about where, we'll see, I'm guessing right about here is 50-50. If I left click, boom, I can apply the rock. Let me control Z. If I come a little bit more to the left, a little bit more, it's still 50% path. Yes, yes. And at some point right about there, I cannot. So it's not detecting 50% path there as well. So that's just good to know. This is saying, yes, we can include it on the path layer, and this is showing the weighting. It's got to be at least 50% path in order for me to place a rock. So you can do that with any of your different foliage types here. All right, guys, that is going to answer some of the common questions that I get as it relates to foliage. Hope you learned a lot. That'll do it all for this video. We will see you in the next one.